just say that. Sorry, I keep forgetting. And she even reminds me. Rose, sorry, Rose. All right. Anyway, I read these words, I hear these words, and I am constantly touched by them. I find them moving. They catch me off guard. You recall them maybe as especially relevant in maybe a missionary service, right? It speaks to the sending out of these 72. And as you might imagine, there are a number of lessons that we could learn from this story. Now, if you're wondering, it's less than 72 lessons, so you can kind of relax a little bit. It's not going to go that long. As we enter the text, I wonder if you noticed that we're not called to do it alone, to go it alone. Did you see that? That Jesus calls them to go out 2 by 2. And this is where he calls them to pray, because evidently they didn't have enough workers, to ask the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into the harvest field. I find it really interesting that as they pray for this prayer, that they become the answer to their own prayer. Did you notice that? Because our prayers often move us in a direction, into action. Prayer is not just simply about us getting something off our chest. It's not simply about something about, okay, there, I've given it to God, I'm done. It's often something that God then calls us to be involved in. Maybe that's why one of the first things that Jesus calls them to do is to pray for help. Maybe that's why sometimes we struggle to really pray. Oh, we're fine giving something to God, right? But, well, that other part, that kind of cramps our style. It can invade our diary. But pray we must. The truth is, this morning, we really didn't read much of this story. Our scripture reading this morning was the first 4 verses of Luke chapter 10. But this story goes on through verse 24, another 20 verses. And it's a wonderful read, something that you should check out this afternoon, not now. But I have to stop. I had to stop at the end of verse 4 because, like I said, I find myself frozen by the words that we have just heard read for us this morning. Many of you know that I was a missionary for 8 years. During that time, I can't tell you how many times I would find myself in a church service or in a missionary service, and these words would be read out. Probably because this was what we were supposed to be about. But interestingly, I found out that quite often we missed what Jesus is saying in these words. And this morning, I want us to look at these words and see what Jesus is saying to us. And I'm talking specifically about verse 3 and verse 4. Go. I am sending you out like lambs among wolves. Do not take a purse or a bag or sandals, and do not greet anyone on the road. Now, I don't know about you, but early on when I read those words, I found them kind of disheartening. I mean, troubling even. But today, I want you to know, I think they're liberating. And this morning, I want to turn our collective attention to what I believe Jesus is saying in these words to you and to me, to us. As you know, we're on this journey, aren't we, with Jesus? I don't know about you, but I think sometimes we get the idea that this is about Jesus and the chosen few, you know, Peter and Andrew and James and John, those kind of people. And yet, did you notice at the very outset of this chapter, the call is not directed singularly to those 12 individuals. In fact, if we're honest, they're off script. They're not even right directly there, because it says Jesus appointed 72 others. I mean, if you go to the text, you'll see it's right there. No one's named. No one is exalted. And I look around at this room and I think about, before our kids left, there was probably close to 72. And I wonder if we are the other. We are those others that Jesus is calling to go. And from the outset, we discover something that is really important for us to recognize, that all of this that Jesus talks about involves movement. Movement is necessary. Jesus calls us not to sit on our tushes, but to get off them and to go. Last week, we spoke of the cost of discipleship, and here it finds its focus in this call to follow, and this call to follow Jesus. And you'll remember last week I shared that it's not a call to blaze our own trail. It's not a call to lead the way. It's not a call to determine our own steps. It's a call to follow the Savior, to follow the Lord, not our own leading. But again, it's about movement. Maybe you're thinking, well, yeah, but did you hear what he sent? He sent them ahead of him. Did he? I can't tell you how many times I have followed God's call on my own life to a place or a people, and I've discovered that as I've arrived in that place that God is there. If you were to read on in the story of Gideon in chapter 7, we read those first 7 verses. Tony read them for us. Again, this afternoon, if you read on in chapter 7, you'll find that Gideon is incredibly apprehensive about this attack. He really doesn't want to do it. He is fearful of the Midianites. And so God suggests that he take a friend and that they go under the cover of darkness and go to the edge of the enemy's camp and listen. And so they creep down there, and you can just see him, he's scared to death, hiding out, and they listen. And as they arrive, they hear this man explaining a dream that he's just had, which he's convinced is declaring that they are going to be destroyed by the army of God. You might say that what Gideon discovers is that God is already on the move, at work before he's even done a thing. You see, the call to go is not a call to move out from God. It's a call to move out with God. As a missionary, I traveled to Ireland, and you know what I discovered when I entered the community where I knew nobody else? I discovered that God was right there. He was already at work in that place. So again, this call to go is not a call to leave his presence, but rather a call to walk in his steps, to be in his presence. It's a call to follow. Of course, we're all good with this. We've heard this all our lives. The Great Commission, go and make disciples of all nations. We know this. But that's not where this story ends, is it? It's certainly not where these verses that we're looking at end. And I actually don't think we have much issue with this idea of being called to go, because what follows is what creates the problem. Did you hear what he said? He says, I'm sending you out like lambs among wolves. I don't know about you, but that imagery is kind of troublesome to me. I don't know what you picture, but I have never seen in a zoo an enclosure with lambs and wolves together. And we all know why, don't we? Because there would not be many lambs left. Well, there wouldn't be any left. There'd be wonderfully well-fed wolves, but no lambs. So what in the world is Jesus suggesting? That we should go out like lambs among wolves? Remember, he's not calling us to be wolves. He's calling us to be like lambs. I think we often hear these words, and we think of the persecuted church. We think of, and these are just some stories from this last year. We think of Indonesian Christian schoolgirls who were dragged from a bus and beheaded. We think of Coptic Christian communities in Egypt who have been obliterated. We think of Sudanese Christian villages destroyed in a hail of gunfire, or Nigerian churches who are wiped off the map. We think of the persecuted church around the world. And so we should. Do you know that there have been more Christians martyred for their faith in the last 100 years than in the previous 1900? And yet, is the persecuted church really what Jesus is talking about here? In this call to go as lambs among wolves? I really don't think so. At least not in its entirety. I believe there's something that is much more essential, something that speaks to those of us who find ourselves living in a place where we don't have to worry about wolves, right? Even if we are lambs. I mean, look at the language, the syntax of how Jesus says this. Jesus is not stating a reality we can do nothing but embrace. I would suggest that he is inviting us to enter our world in a specific way. I mean, think about that for a moment. I mean, we may find lambs adorable, and they are, even if they are vulnerable. But I really think that we much prefer power and control to being vulnerable, don't we? We much prefer to enter a situation where we're in charge than to find ourselves at the mercy of others. I mean, let's face it, lambs are completely reliant on the shepherd for protection. If the shepherd sleeps, the lamb dies. If the shepherd is distracted, the lamb dies. Sheep have no ability to defend themselves, and we prefer to rely on ourselves, our resources, our ingenuity. We feel we're much better off if we have a little money in our wallet, our purse. And yet it's clear that we too need to place our dependency on the Good Shepherd. Of course, the question remains, is this the reason why Jesus calls to enter the world in this way? That we might be dependent on him? I think you have to admit that's not a bad reason. But there's something else we discover as we look to Jesus. You see, this is exactly how Jesus came, as a lamb among wolves. He could have come as a conquering hero. He could have come as a king or a despot, but instead he came as a baby, a defenseless baby, born to a poor peasant girl. As Paul said, he emptied himself. He made himself nothing. He humbled himself. And truth is, in the first year of his life, where did he end up? He ended up as a refugee fleeing for his life. And the more I think about it, the more I realize that what Jesus is doing in saying and calling us to come out, to go as lambs among wolves, is he's calling to follow his example. And John's clear, isn't he, in his first letter where he says we must walk as Jesus walked. I've been thinking about how we like to be able to defend ourselves, how we like to win the debate. And yet it would seem that Jesus calls us to not to enter our world with arguments, but with vulnerable love. I know that kind of seems insane, doesn't it? And yet when Jesus needed to speak to defend himself before his accusers, he was silent, wasn't he? Like a lamb. Of course, we're not done. We've just looked at that first phrase. Jesus continues, and what he says next is as perplexing as what we've already read. He says, do not take a purse or bag or sandals. I mean, what in the world is this about? In the NLT, it reads it this way: don't take any money with you, nor a traveler's bag, nor an extra pair of sandals. I mean, this seems kind of ridiculous, doesn't it? I mean, I'm all for packing light and traveling light, but this is beyond the pale. And yet, as the church, I've discovered that we feel that we are more able to make a difference in our world when we have the resources, right? When we have the people that we need, when we have the healthy balance in our checking account, when we have the stuff. And yet Jesus, again, I think is calling us to not rely on those things, to not depend on our own resources, but instead to depend on him. You know, the thing is, we need to remember and to realize and to remind ourselves again and again that the hope of the world is not me, it's not you, it's not us, it is him. I pastored a church in the States. We raised over $650,000 a year just in tithes and offerings. We had 17 acres. We had a full-size gymnasium. We had multiple staff, a sanctuary that could hold 650 people. We had a car park that would make the one at Asda look small. I mean, it was huge. It would be easy to think, well, you know, I wish we could have that. Wouldn't it be healthy? Wouldn't it be wonderful to have a healthy balance like that in our checking account? I mean, if we had those sorts of resources, what a difference we could make in this world. And then we hear the words of Jesus. Don't take any money with you. And I find myself wondering if we get enamored in the wrong things, if we become defeated because we don't have, well, you know, you fill in the blank. And we do the same thing as individuals. Maybe you heard the plea for helpers in our children's work, and you sat there thinking, well, I don't have the resources. I don't have what it takes to make a difference. Maybe we're looking at the wrong things. I really believe the reason Jesus called on them to go empty-handed was because it would force them to rely on him, much like Gideon's army. But I believe there's another reason. I remember during our missionary presence in Wicklow, we had been in this home. We'd been living in this house that we'd found when we first moved there. And we'd been there about a year. I mean, it was adequate. It met our needs. It was a wonderful place. You could see the sea from the window of the kitchen. Wonderful. But the end of our lease was coming, and the owners said that they wanted back in and they wanted us out. Now you think, well, that's, you know, just have to find another place. The problem was that housing in Wicklow was going crazy. Rents had risen by 50% that year. You know, instead of €1,000, 1,500 euros for the same house. Our income had not risen 50%. Our support had not risen 50%. And the real estate agent who had helped us find our home, a guy named Eugene, told me, he said, you know, this is going to be impossible for you to find a place to live for what you can afford. I mean, we were in trouble. We didn't have the resources to resolve this situation. We prayed about it. We looked everywhere, but nothing. And Eugene would keep asking me, have you found a place? I said, no. He says, I'm looking, but you're not going to find anything. God bless him. Well, about a week before we were going to get kicked out, he calls me up. He says, Steve, I found you a place. I was like, how much? And he because I was thinking about the resources we had, right? You know, so he goes, well, before even answering that question, he said, he gave me the address. He says, meet me there in 10 minutes. So Annette and I got into our car and we drove up there. Eugene, if you knew him, he just says, and you'd go, you know, it's one of those guys. So we met him up there. And as I'm driving into that little estate, I'm thinking, there is no way we're going to be able to live here. There is just no way. And then I drove up to the house and I'm like, oh my goodness, there is no way. It was a fully detached house, 5 bedrooms, 3 baths. It had a pirate ship in the back garden. I'm serious. Look, have a look. See it? I mean, we're not talking a pirate ship. We're talking a pirate ship. I mean, you could get 10 kids up in that thing, and kids loved it. And I'm standing out in that back garden on the deck, and my wife is running around. She's just she's just so excited. This is beautiful with the owner's wife. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? How am I going to let her down? And she's not going to be happy, and this is not going to go well. And Eugene's standing there beside me, and I go, so, all right, how much is it going to cost? And he goes, it's exactly the same as what you're paying now for that little house that you have. And I go, how in the world did you manage that? He said, well, I told them I wouldn't take my fee. And I told them that you could be trusted with their house because they were moving to Canada. And I was like, oh, dear God, thank you. What has that got to do with what Jesus is saying here? I would suggest in some ways everything. Because in our need, others stepped into that gap and helped us. And in doing that, Eugene became more strongly connected to us than ever before. He had helped us. We owed him. And that next year, his wife was diagnosed with cancer. And I was able to step into his life and walk with him, to love him, to listen to his cries, to pray with him. You see, our need opened a door that Jesus could enter through. I think we think that our lack is to our detriment. We think it as a church, we think it as individuals, but guess what? It's not. I really believe that God honors us as we, instead of looking to trust in what we have, that we trust in him. Because when we do, incredible things happen. I wonder, in whom do you trust? There's one final phrase from these crazy words of Jesus, right? And then he goes, and don't greet anyone on the road. And I'm going, this sounds borderline rude. It's kind of like, what is he going on here? Some commentators have talked about how Near Eastern greetings could go on quite a bit. And so obviously it would take a lot of time because you'd have to talk about their family and your family and all of these things. But I really think that Jesus, what he's saying, it's not about those along the road. This is about us. He's speaking about how we allow distractions to keep us from the path that we've been called to walk. And how we should allow nothing to distract us from his call to go to this journey that we're called to walk, that nothing should get in the way. I find myself wondering, what distracts you? What distracts me? What prevents us from getting involved in this call to go, to follow Jesus, to journey with him? I mean, there are so many things, right? I mean, there's fear. And maybe as I look at this passage that we've been looking at, maybe it's that instead of relying on our own resources, that we're being called to rely on him. And that's sometimes hard, to always be in need, to always be relying on others, on God. Maybe it's that instead of being in control, that we have to find ourselves in a place where we are vulnerable. Like I said, I used to find these words incredibly difficult to read, but I find them liberating today. I find them helpful. I wonder, how many of you have been caught up in the story of Ernest Shackleton and the ship in the Antarctic? Have you seen those pictures? I mean, it's absolutely incredible. I've got a couple of them up here to show you. The ship Endurance, over 106 years, it's been down at the bottom of the sea. And here they discovered it just this couple of weeks ago, I think it was. I mean, it's amazing. And what a great name for a ship like that, right? Endurance. I mean, this journey that they took endurance in many ways. I was reading how that before Ernest Shackleton left England, he was putting together a team, a group to go with him. He was looking for individuals who would volunteer to come on that ship with him. And he put an ad in the paper. And this is how the ad read. Are you ready? Men wanted for hazardous journey, small wages, bitter cold, long months of complete darkness, constant danger, safe return doubtful. Is that like, I mean, what was he expecting? Like nobody to sign up? I mean, and I read those words and in my mind, I'm thinking, yeah, go. I'm sending you like lambs among wolves. Don't take anything with you and don't say hi to anybody on the road. It kind of sounds the same, doesn't it? But you see, the promise is, whereas Shackleton was right, safe return may have been doubtful. The truth is, he is with us. And so the question is really, will we take up this call? Will we answer the call? Will we go vulnerably? Will we pack lightly? Will we choose to be distracted by nothing, but follow hard after Christ? If you read on in this story this afternoon, you'll discover that there's a lot of rejoicing and joy later on in the passage. And that, I think, sounds about right. Because when we follow Jesus, even if we have nothing, we discover we have joy. Because in him, we have more than enough. Amen? Katie, come and lead us.